Hi, Marcus. You probably don't know me well. I was invited by Vaadin to Turku, and I think it was around 3 to 4 years ago. And I helped you to integrate the backend Vaadin with CDI and Java EE 6 or 7 back then.
Okay.
And so we stayed in touch. So at Java One and Code One at the conferences, I came to your booth and had a conversation with your CEO or CTO. I forgot his name.
Jonas, probably?
Yeah, exactly, Jonas. So I know Jonas for a longer time, and I also knew some core Vaadin developers who implemented the Vaadin servlet on the backend. So I had some interaction already with them. Did we met in Turku? No.
No. I've been in the U.S. now in our California office for the past 6 and some years, so over 6 years. So I was probably here already by then.
So we never met. So I did some research on the web, and I wanted to see what you're actually doing. And what surprised me, you have some EJB3 experience, right?
Yeah, that was way back in my in the start of my career. It was my first job was taking a old application that they had and rewriting it using the then very new EJB3 standards, and so that was kind of my first real life experience with Java and kind of the enterprise side of things.
And were you pragmatic with development, or you had to implement 50 layers and crazy stuff like that?
I think that the reason why we did this refactoring back in the day was just because it was kind of this 50 layers architecture, and when we moved over to EJB3, we simplified that quite a bit to make it much more manageable for developers to reason about.
Hey, cool. So you were quite successful back then, right?
Yeah, well, we got the app working. It went into production and was successful there. So I think that was a pretty good thing for a first project.
Okay. And was it the very, very first Java project?
Not like my first Java project. I've done some stuff on my own. So I kind of knew some Java before, but that was like my first job project.
Okay. So what was your first Hello World? So in which language you wrote your first Hello World, or whatever first line of code which worked? Do you remember that?
I think I honestly got started on the web just playing around in the browser, changing things, writing small snippets of JavaScript. Then in high school and stuff, I did some C++ and other courses that they offered. And Java didn't actually come in until much later, like at university for me.
Mm-hmm. And what you did is the first what you wrote. What was your first running application?
Oh man, what was it? It must have been some sort of like JavaScript thing that changes your toolbar, or
something like this,
or shows the time, or something else that's equally impressive.
And your equally impressive, and your first Java application?
That was a besides Hello World app, that would have been the app that I spoke of. So it was kind of a meeting collaboration type of application.
Oh, cool!
So it kind of went from very simple to quite complex in a short period of time.
And you immediately joined Vaadin after your university, or what was your
So my background was actually the company that I worked at when I was in university was using the framework that would later be called Vaadin. And since I happened to be in a university which was right across the street from the Vaadin office, anytime I had trouble getting something working or something, I found a bug or something, I could just walk over and knock on the door and say like, hey, this isn't working, like, help me out. And after a while, they were basically just like, well, how about you just stay over here?
Okay, cool.
So once I graduated, I started working at Vaadin. That was in I think it was like early 2010.
Okay,
it's been a while.
Okay, so you just you just started with Vaadin and you stick with Vaadin, right?
Yeah, for like my Java career, Vaadin has been the main UI framework for me. I have worked with GWT on kind of extending things on the client side there. I've used Spring and Java EE and all kinds of backend things, but in terms of like UI stuff in Java, that's been my main thing. For the past several years, I've been working more on our front end related technologies and kind of focused more on that side of the development at Vaadin.
What is actually the history of Vaadin? You told me the company before Vaadin. So what was the name of Vaadin before Vaadin?
So before Vaadin was called Vaadin, it was called IT Mill Toolkit. And before that, it was called Millstone. So the framework actually came out with the first kind of public release in, I think it was 2001 or 2. And for those that don't know, Vaadin has this kind of very strict separation between the server side code that you write, which is on a fairly high level of abstraction. So you're dealing with things like buttons and horizontal and vertical layouts and click listeners and things that on a conceptual level don't really change all that much over time. So that has allowed the framework to evolve from, in the beginning, essentially doing just XML with XSLT transformations and just like full page reloads to somewhere around 2005, we had our own homegrown Ajax client that allowed us to do much more fine-grained updates to the browser. Then when Google Web Toolkit came out, we switched over to having that power our browser essentially. And then in the last couple of years, we've moved over from using GWT to using standards-based web components for the UI implementation. So having this separation between the API that we give our Java users and then the implementation that we provide has allowed us to kind of update the framework to match all the new technologies in the browser without having to break the Java API that much over time.
And who started the company? Was it Jonas?
Yeah, it was him, and I think it was about three other people, if I remember correctly. So it was a small group of people. If I remember the origin story correctly, they were all working on a healthcare project in Perl back in the day that was supposed to run on the web, and essentially realized that, like, consider building a web app in Perl in like 1999. It wasn't necessarily the easiest task to compose a very complex business application out of very small building blocks and primitives. So they figured, like, desktop programmers have a component-based way of building applications. Surely there should be something similar for the web in order for us to be able to really start building more meaningful applications on it.
So they started the project first, so they were involved in the project, and then they extracted the product from the project, right?
If I understood correctly, yeah, they kind of, I don't know if they, I don't think they like exactly extract the project from it since the language was different, but I think that led to them having a lot of ideas on how they would like to build a project and kind of use those ideas and that use case as a catalyst for kind of creating this product. So it was very much built out of a necessity or kind of to fulfill a need that they have had themselves. So those cases are kind of easy when you can kind of really put yourself in the customer's shoes or the user's shoes, because you essentially are the user.
So they, and then the consultants became a product company, right? So the product was created, and properly you had already side projects, but from then we got Vaadin, right?
Correct. So the product itself was open sourced quite early on, realizing that having the product open source generated more visibility for it, also generated more kind of trust in us as a small Finnish company. So bigger clients were also more comfortable using the technology, knowing that for whatever reason we would cease to exist, they would still at least have access to the framework and would be able to have like a contingency plan on how to go forward. But essentially from those days, I think we, especially around when it kind of started picking up with ITML Toolkit, but really when we rebranded to Vaadin around, I think it was 2008 or 9, I think we saw a really big kind of upswing in the amount of community members and just people who were active with Vaadin and promoting it to their peers, and that kind of led to a much bigger growth for us.
Exactly, and so Vaadin is like comprises two parts. So you have the front end parts, which communicates via binary protocol with servlet, and the servlet translates that in a higher level calls. At the end of the day, it's completely transparent to the developer. So what the developer only have to do is to implement on the Java side. It looks like Swing to me, or JavaFX or AWT is just like a native component toolkit in pure Java.
Yep.
And it just generates components on the front end. And what I think also why Vaadin was so successful, it was always visually appealing. So from the beginning, the docs looked right and the aesthetics were right. And this is, of course, not common in enterprise Java projects, right?
Yeah.
So and why I'm mentioning this, because in one point of time, you decided to have Vaadin elements, which is interesting again, because if the architecture is right, you could decouple the front end from the back end, and this is what you did. So you have right now in the front end Vaadin elements, which are actually web components and can be used without the Java backend. This is right?
Yes. Correct. So we have a set of just standards-based web components. I touched on this earlier when I was talking about the evolution of the different client-side engines that we've had over the years. And essentially, we were at a point where we've been building components for the web for the past, 10, 12, 15 years, a long time. So we had a lot of experience in building components. And now there was a set of standards coming out that allowed us to actually express those components as platform native components instead of having to use something like GWT to essentially emulate those components in the browser. Mm-hmm. So that idea was very appealing to us. Already kind of back in the days when we switched from our homegrown UI kind of Ajax library on the client to using GWT, we were considering trying to make these components, kind of decouple them from the framework so that other GWT users would be able to use them in their projects standalone from Vaadin. That, for whatever reason, didn't pan out, but with the web component rewrite, we essentially sat down to build a new set of components using everything that we've learned from what user needs are, and also with just kind of the new context of being in, I think it was 2016 or something when we started, just having vastly different requirements for what a set of components needs to do than 10 years prior. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to spend a lot of time making sure that they are accessible to things like screen readers. We wanted to make sure that they work very well on mobile devices, so they adapt to screen sizes and they have sufficiently big touch targets, and just kind of did a real big overhaul. And because of the web components standards, it meant that we were able to make the components also available to a much bigger audience of developers than just the Java community.
Mm-hmm. And the Vaadin elements, which happen to be the elements we are talking about, the web components we are talking about, are the same components which I would use or would be generated for me if I would use stock Vaadin?
That's correct. So if you create in Java, you create a Vaadin vertical layout, you put two buttons in it, or you create that would generate the same exact HTML code running in the browser as if you had written the custom element into your HTML yourself. So it's if you look at the generated DOM from a Vaadin application, it's very easy to reason about. It exactly like one-to-one mapping essentially between your Java objects and the custom elements.
This is actually great because I think then you are one of the Vue frameworks with no clean markup. So if you just take a look at Google Web Toolkit, it's a mess. I think no one can understand what's going on there. Generated
Yeah,
markup.
and that's kind of out of necessity because back then Google Web Toolkit lacked the platform primitives that were needed to really kind of do this kind of thing. So they were resorted to essentially emulating, taking these lower level building blocks like spans and divs and just wrapping them up in JavaScript and taping them to look like whatever component they needed to look like. Whereas now we're able to actually leverage some of these new browser features and actually have them behave and look the way that they are. So it's much easier to look at the code. With the latest version, we also kind of wanted to make the Java API closer to the web in a way that you're now able to take any of the Java components and like in the when you're working in Java and the Java API, you're able to call get element on them and get essentially the underlying DOM element reference. So if you want to add like a JavaScript listener on it for, I don't know, hovering or something else, you can do that directly from the Java code, which is quite powerful, especially if you're trying to integrate some third-party components or if you want to extend a component in a way that the original author didn't necessarily think about.
Yeah, this is actually amazing. So what you could do with that, you could register Java listeners to third-party custom elements, right?
That's correct. So if you have like a third-party web component that you've created yourself or you've found somewhere, the integration to Vaadin is very simple, at least in my opinion. Essentially, you create a Java class that extends from component. You do a @JavaScript annotation to import the source file for it. Then you do a tag annotation to tell which HTML tag this component will associate itself with. And then you just use this element API. So you can have, for instance, a setter which calls the element API set property or set attribute to set that attribute or property, and then you can add the listeners for JavaScript events in directly from Java. So essentially you can integrate any web component directly from Java without even having to write like a JavaScript connector of any kind, which is pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, this is actually very cool. So now, just a little bit context to you. So I'm actually a backend Java developer, and what I really like is the simplicity. So I would like to keep my wars without any external dependencies. So I just focus on business logic. And of course, a few years ago, clients started to ask me what you would suggest us in the front end. And of course, there are frameworks, lots of frameworks, but I didn't like them because to me, they looked like, enterprise application Java EE 20 years ago, like lots of layers and code generation and stuff what nobody understands. So what I started to do 2 years ago, I would say, I just used plain ES6 and Web Component, Shadow DOM, custom elements, and CSS3, just bare bone code. And for enterprise apps where Chrome was allowed to use, whereas enterprise standard, we didn't even have NPM. It was just, like web development in, I would say, 1995. So no builds, nothing, but just web standards. And then I attended Java 1, Code 1 this year. And I wanted to talk with Jonas that I knew that Vaadin has the Vaadin elements. Like whatever you do, just drop whatever you can. Just focus on web standards. And Jonas told me I have to talk to you, but because I just spent 2 days at Code One because of my workload, I had no time to talk to you. So I suggested we can talk at the podcast. And now also funny at Java 1, I delivered a talk like PWAs without frameworks or something like this.
Yep.
And in the research, I took a look on your session, and it was very, very similar to mine. And then I did some research, and I found another session. It's like, what you are talking about? So I'm not crazy. You can absolutely be, productive without any frameworks. And at the same time, my clients ask me, but what you can do if we need, complex grid? And I always pointed to Vaadin or sometimes to prime faces, depends on from which background they came. For instance, to take the Vaadin grid, and they say, yeah, but this is hard. And what I did in my workshop, I just integrated the Vaadin third-party component just without NPM. What I did, I just copied the code and just imported as ES6. And then with the API, which was well documented, I think I passed an array of JavaScript objects, and they were immediately visible on the in the table. And we did some scrolling, and everyone was happy. So, and what surprised me, at least what was what I saw, you have a similar mindset. You can say right now, forgot frameworks. You can achieve a lot without any frameworks. Is it correct?
Well, I think there's still definitely a place for frameworks, but I also think that it's very kind of interesting to see just how much you can do without frameworks, so that you really realize where you need the framework. So for some simple projects that I'm working on, it can be more than enough to just have something like a router and some custom components and or custom elements, and that's it. I mean, that can already give me most of the features that I would have used out of a framework.
Exactly. But even router is actually very easy to implement. You know, you have a hash change event, or you have a router, I would say, or you could hook up some click listeners on links, and you replace one DOM element. You have a router. Actually, I wrote a router. It was I think 50 lines of code and 2 custom elements.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's depending, of course, on what your needs are. That can be as short as a couple of lines of code.
Yeah,
but yeah, like you're definitely correct, and I think it's going to web components and custom elements and the standards that are coming out are definitely, I think, going to mean that frameworks can become much smaller and more modular as time goes on. So before, essentially, web framework needed to ship all of the things that it needed. So it had to ship its own component model, and it needed to ship all of these things by itself, whereas now it can focus more on the frameworky things like state management or orchestration between components, or things that make this framework different from other frameworks. So it doesn't need to duplicate a lot of the things that the web platform itself is already giving it.
Yeah. So and web platform gives us a lot. So to call the backend, there is one function called fetch. If you would like to have WebSockets, there is new WebSocket. And also interesting, you also seem to like service workers, what I also did. So I actually recorded a workshop called, Effective Java WebStandards. And what I did there, or Effective Web is the name of the workshop. And I created an offline stocks app with service workers. And the cool story with service workers is they are really easy to explain Java developers. Because at the end of the day, it's like, a message listener which has access to a hash map, which is type, whose request and response. So there's actually relatively easy to implement, a little bit harder to test, because in one point of time it couldn't just cache too much. But it is actually amazing how much is out there. It's actually more what we had at the Swing days, right?
Yeah. I think the service worker is just an incredibly powerful tool. Like you said, it can be sometimes a little bit hard to use it properly and kind of make sure that you're only caching what you need and stuff. Fortunately for that, there are good libraries like Workbox, which can really help you with things like that. So you can specify, like, I want to cache images, but only up to 100 of them, or 200 megs, and expire the oldest ones first. And you can define these much more higher level caching strategies, which would probably take you quite a bit of code to get right yourself. So I think that's also one of the nice things about the web providing these low-level APIs, is that library vendors are able to then provide these different high-level APIs for them also, for those cases where you need them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I'm in Vue projects where migrating from old Swing and JavaFX to WebStandards only. And what I suggested to the developers, they are seasoned Java developers, so they are really good. So just start first with plain service worker, that you really understand what's going on. And I'm actually against code generators, because they generate you something, and if it doesn't work always, you are lost.
Yeah.
But if you start with lean code and then you can be inspired by Workbox or other, I would turn it around in serious project. The same is true for the router, for instance. So, for instance, the router, if you implement a very simple router, it is going to be too simple in first place because you would like to have a preconditions checks or security checks, but you are completely flexible, so you can still implement them if you need them. Mm-hmm. And if you take, React router or Angular router or other routers, there's this almost, they are overwhelming what they are able to do. So you will have to understand, everything first in order to use it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And that's essentially, that was one of my talks at Code One was exactly this. So I showed hands-on how to build first a web component with just nothing but the standard APIs, how to build a service worker with nothing but the standard APIs. Mm-hmm. And after that kind of showed some of the different tools and libraries that are available if you want to, but I really kind of implored people to first understand what the browser already provides and how that works, because it's much easier to go the way that you said, that you kind of start small and lean, and then you only add complexity where needed and if it's actually needed.
Mm-hmm. But this is, I think, only true for Java developers, because the modern JavaScript looks almost like Java. If I were a jQuery developer, I think it would be better to just use a framework, because I could just, survive somehow.
Well, I'm sure jQuery developers are able to pick up new standards as well, but sure, yeah, it's.
Of course. But if you search, for instance, for jQuery versus JavaScript, there was actually a very valid question a few years ago. Should I start with? Should I? Yeah. Is it should I know JavaScript in order to be productive with jQuery? And no kidding. There was like
I definitely understand, and I've heard, like, I've had the same with, especially like back in the Angular 1 days. It was like you would run into people who were Angular developers, but they didn't necessarily feel like they knew JavaScript, or like their knowledge is very kind of narrowly specific to this one framework or library. And
I think for those developers, this is not true, right? Also, for those developers, you cannot just start with WebComponents, because this is actually a true, I would say, software engineering, or you have to hack code like you did before with Java, right?
Yeah.
But it's very transparent. So what are the weak points, just because we are somehow compatible with our thoughts? I think what is missing is a robust template, right? So we have the S6 literals, but what we don't have in the standard, and Apple actually proposed one standard, but I'm really interested whether something happens with it. And what we need, something like mustache, and this is our handlebars, is like, JSP syntax inside the browser.
Yep.
And the reason why we need it is just, I think, for security, because without that, it is really easy to run into cross-site scripting attacks. Agreed?
I agree, both for security, but also really for performance. So if you do the kind of very simple, for instance, you just do inner HTML for everything, it's of course not very secure, like you said. But also if you just basically trash and recreate a whole big part of your DOM for any change that you have to your UI, that can actually be pretty poorly performing and kind of lead to bad user experience. So I'm also very interested in seeing how that one spec proposal on the templates moves along. But fortunately, there are some pretty interesting projects in the user space,
like lit HTML, and this is the other commonality. I use lit HTML for a long time, and what I always use, I don't use the lit element from Polymer. Yep. I just include two functions, HTML and render, as just import them, and then let render my component with lit HTML, which is very, very efficient, and this is absolutely transparent what happens. And Vaadin is also using lit HTML, right? The new Vaadin elements.
The current Vaadin elements aren't, as far as I know, using them yet. It's they are compatible with lit HTML, and we're kind of looking for the next components are most likely going to use lit HTML, and then as we kind of refactor the existing components, they will most likely use it. But yeah, it's something that I personally also used for a good while. I really enjoy the simplicity of it, the fact that it's just JavaScript essentially from the developer's perspective, and also from the browser's perspective. It's because it's using these platform native functions like the template literal and the HTML template tags. It's able to be just very, very efficient in what it's doing without being complex to use.
So it is actually amazing on multiple levels. So first, it is short. So I think the first lit HTML, it fit on one slide, and Google I/O conference was presented. So it's a really short library. It's not a framework. It is actually just a function. What you said is this ES6 template literal function with the name HTML, and the other is render. So actually the other is just render function, but the only one is HTML. So it could be, this is like standard extension from JavaScript. And now comes the amazing part. So lit HTML and hyper HTML, so both are related. They are very efficient because internally they remember what changed, and they only changed this DOM elements which are actually affected. And this is what you mentioned, why the performance is better, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when you call a lit or you create that lit HTML template with the HTML template tag, it will return you something called a template result, which is essentially it parses that template. It finds all the places in the template where you've used JavaScript, basically where the changing parts are, where you've used JavaScript to add some logic or bind a variable. It keeps track of those, and then it creates just a static cached template for the rest of it. So whenever you change something, it doesn't need to parse anything. It just kind of produces, updates the values in the right holes in the template, and it's very fast.
And this is the alternative to so-called virtual DOM, where they build the entire DOM in memory, and then on end of transaction or request, they would create a div and apply the differences to the real DOM. The problem with that, it consumes more memory. So per accident, the WebStandard is even consumes less memory and is very fast, right?
Yeah, there's a community member who's pretty active in the lit community, who has a really interesting kind of suite of performance testing all kinds of different rendering templates, and lit consistently outperforms virtual DOM, especially for more complex UIs.
Yeah, it has to, because the having a complex object tree, maintaining twice, computing the diff and reapplying, in one point of time should break.
Yeah, essentially the complexity of a lit template grows with the amount or the number of dynamic nodes in it, whereas the complexity of a virtual DOM template grows with the amount of DOM nodes you have in it. So it's especially when you get to larger templates, it's very well performing compared to something like virtual DOM. And for me personally, I enjoy the fact that it's less magic. It's just using the web platform provided standards.
Yeah, absolutely. You can explain to everyone what happens behind the scenes. I'm not so sure about these sophisticated frameworks. So now I'm curious. I'm asking a question. I'm really curious about your answer. So what is your opinion about Angular 2+? So 4, 5, 6, and 7, and whatever it comes next year?
Well, I think they're coming out with like 2 or 4 a year, maybe 2, maybe. I don't remember exactly, but several. To me, like the first time I saw it, it looked like Java EE for the front end.
Yeah, exactly.
It's I don't know if that was their intention to kind of make a safe space for enterprise developers to move over to front end development. It feels like that because they provide very many of the same patterns and kind of conveniences that you would expect to find in an enterprise framework. You have dependency injection and all kinds of testing tools, and just you have a typed environment with TypeScript and everything. So
the modules are interesting. So the modules, this is really what I absolutely don't get why they are there, because whatever you're doing, you will have to declare it in a module, export the thing, import the thing. There's 3 or 4 places where you have to maintain your code. And this is actually really hard. So therefore, there is CLI, which is supposed to generate your stuff, which we actually had in enterprise development, 20 years, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And exactly. And
So
yeah,
apparently they are one of the kind of reasons why they have that very kind of clunky module system is that they predate some of those ES6 specs. So I was at a meetup here in the Bay Area not too long ago with spoke at the same time as one of the Angular tech leads, and apparently they are in the future versions of Angular looking to get rid of that proprietary module and just use ES modules instead, which I think will make it much saner for people to use.
This is what I understand. Okay, so if they say this is like replacement of the ES6 module standard, so this is what I would understand, but no one can. Yeah, okay. But this would mean in one point of time even more migration for Angular projects, right?
I would assume so. I don't know if they would.
No,
they would probably maintain backwards compatibility, or then they would try to provide some sort of tool for migration. I'm not entirely sure. It's looking from the side, it does seem like there's some amount of friction with every migration there, and sometimes they're bigger than others. So of course that's the opposite of what, of course, if they were trying to get people coming from an enterprise background to this safe space that they built on the front end. I think that's one part where they're perhaps failing, is that enterprise developers don't necessarily like having breaking changes every 6 months to their code, because that makes it very hard to kind of keep up with deadlines.
Actually, developers love it, but managers don't like it.
Oh yeah, well, that's true.
I'm really right now in lots of projects where we migrate away from Angular, and the reasons what you said. No one is interested in watching the breaking changes. But I think what will happen in future is all the frameworks will melt down, because if Angular replaces the module system with ES6 modules, then it will even more look like WebComponents without any framework. And they have, I think, Angular Elements is the name. So they have already support for custom elements. So at the end of the day, TypeScript will remain, and dependency injection, I think. I'm not sure about the dependency injection, because even in the more complex projects in the front end, you probably get, I don't know, 2 to 3 classes referenced in a web component, and this is very easy to create them with new. So I don't think the dependency injection is that important to me.
Yeah, and you can also have kind of service classes essentially, so you can import just the methods you need from a separate file into your component, and that's actually more efficient build time, because you can actually tree shake, and if you only used one method from your service instead of the whole thing, then you can actually eliminate more dead code out of your final
and
build.
It looks like dependency injection, because it was write something like import let's say load clients from something else, and you just import the function. And it's even less code, because you don't have to use add inject, and the function could be even static. So in the class static or just a function. Correct.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think right now we have two ways of developing standard apps or web apps. So the first one is using a framework which is able to achieve everything, and I'm talking about infrastructural framework. Or just stick with WebStandards and use polyfills. And with the polyfills, over time, you can delete the polyfills, because the browsers are catching up, and they are catching up faster and faster. So this is actually the trend, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, the web is moving forward. So I would imagine that there will be new cool features and new polyfills coming out. So for instance, this week I went to Chrome Dev Summit, and they were discussing some new proposals for instance, having a scheduler exposed to the developers, for instance, so they could have more say over the different priorities of their tasks more than they have currently with the task queues and micro task queues on the actual JavaScript event loop. Also, I think, so for something like that, there might be a need for polyfilling backwards if you want to take advantage of stuff like that.
Yeah, but this is like a micro optimization already, right? So
for sure, yeah. I mean, that's but like kind of coming back to your question about what you would use a framework for, I think one of the things that frameworks may help developers do in the future also is kind of help especially developers who don't feel like spending very much time optimizing code themselves, create more kind of they give people guide rails, and they give people kind of a set of codified best practices, like this is how, if you write your app like this, then they will take care of it running okay. But of course, the nice thing with the standards is that you're like, if you know how they work, you can also just use them yourself and produce something that's probably even more performant, or even nicer or cleaner or leaner.
Leaner. I think leaner is the most important thing. Developer experience in simplicity. So
Yep.
because as the micro optimization make it smaller, it does not matter in enterprise at all, because in enterprise project you are usually in intranet, so the network is fast, and the machines are fast. In internet, I see the problem, so this should be optimized. But with HTTP2, for instance. It is not you don't even need a bundler. You can just deliver the individual files, and the performance is usually good enough.
Yeah. It depends. There might be some overhead from parsing several files, but it's usually not huge. Depending on, like, that would be more CPU constrained in that case.
Sure.
I think there are also other pretty cool things coming out, especially that might be interesting in an enterprise environment, is just taking more advantage of workers and WebAssembly to run some even more complex things in the browser in the future. So that's something that I'm at least personally looking forward to playing around with a little bit and exploring.
I think one interesting thing which came out is in Chrome 70 is now it's final, that you can install the web app on as a native app. So before you have to have the development switches, but right now it is native. So what it means is, in Service Worker, you can catch an event, and there is I think client claim method, and if you call it in one point of time, if you run the app several times, Chrome will ask you, would you like to install the app locally? And what it does, it installs with the web manifesto. You have to declare the web manifesto. Web manifest. I forgot about that, but it will install the whole app and Chrome locally as a native app. It really looks on Mac like an application, right?
Yeah, and if you get first, as I installed Twitter on my computer, and if I get a push notification through that, it actually opens the installed application and not a browser tab now, so it actually integrates pretty well.
So I think Vaadin is now per accident in a very good place, right? Because because if you don't need the infrastructural frameworks, and what you will need always is a good looking and I would say powerful components, because no way that someone will implement in a project, a fast grid. I think this is mission impossible. Regardless how talented you are, you just cannot do this.
It's not really practical. I mean, you have other goals in a project, and the goals very rarely include spending 2, 3, 4 months on building a grid.
Yeah, but the cool story is you can start with your own, homegrown component, and if you find out it is not good enough, then you can just replace this custom element with something from Vaadin.
Yep.
And this is actually a great news, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Funny, I was. You were on Devox conference?
Not this year, no.
So I'm back from Devox, and after my talk, so what I did, the first half I talk about a micro profile, and then I hacked on stage like CSS grid with some custom elements. And some people came to me and asked me the question, why you need frameworks at all? And one of them had a Vaadin t-shirt on. And I say, are you from Vaadin? So don't be, afraid, because Vaadin is just a set of elements which you can just buy, and they work great. We are not from Vaadin. We just like the t-shirt, and we have and we like. We had a talk at the conference, and we had a chat, and they already are in the web components mode. So they had some remaining questions. So it seems like like, how to call it, a revolution starts right now. More and more projects finding out that actually the plain standard is sufficient for, I would say, 80% of all applications, I would even claim.
Yeah, and even then, like one thing where I've seen web components and custom elements be really kind of useful in enterprise settings is that the development environments across different teams or the tech stacks can be fairly different. So one team might be using one framework, one team is still using jQuery, and somebody's using something else. And using a common standard like web components, they're able to build components within the organization that all these different projects are able to use. And they can, of course, in new projects, they can then decide if they want the framework at all or not, but they can still get a very kind of consistent and reusable set of components also internally, which saves a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. And the barrier of interoperability is actually fairly low. There was one page, custom elements everywhere, I think. This was like, and this was compatibility between frameworks, and most of the frameworks were compatible. I think React had some problems, but all others were.
React is essentially the only one, like, of the big frameworks right now that has some interoperability problems. Mostly those have to do with the fact that React tries to set any properties, like anything you set on a custom element, it will always try to serialize and set it as an attribute. So you can't pass in actual like objects as properties, which makes things pretty difficult. And also, I think it has if I remember correctly, there was something with listening to events and cases. So it doesn't work very smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but for other frameworks that have kind of embraced this more, it's pretty smooth.
Mm-hmm. And Polymer seems like it destroys itself because now they propose the lit element, right? And but there's almost nothing left from Polymer, right?
Yeah, and I mean, if you go back 3 years or 4 years to kind of what they were saying, their whole mission statement for Polymer was to go away at some point. They wanted to kind of be a proving ground and testing ground and an accelerator for web standards. And as those standards became available, they wanted to kind of make themselves smaller and smaller until they're no longer needed. And I think what they kind of consider right now is that they're at a point where they've solved most of their initial goal, and now they're forked into these different other smaller projects where they're trying to push other parts of the web forward, like with lit HTML and things like PWA helpers. So that's kind of my interpretation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a great job. This is a kind of an anti-framework, which I really like.
Yeah. Well, I think they actually call themselves an anti-framework.
Oh, really?
At some conference where I was.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know this. So I always said, okay, Polymer is like, the anti-framework, and I hope no one is get offended by that. But if they claim it by themselves, kudos.
I might be wrong. It might have been somebody else.
No, sure.
You're not the first person to say that to me, at least.
Oh, okay, cool. The only thing which I still don't like is the whole installation with NPM. This is the last bit of magic. Not actually. The thing is downloaded to Node modules, which is a folder, and then you need to do something with it. So what I did with lit HTML is I just copied the folder, which is downloaded by Node modules, to my folder, and it just works right away. So I can just import that, and it works. It does not work with all projects, but it works well with lit HTML. What are your thoughts about integrating third-party custom elements? Let's say from Vaadin. So is there something what I could use without NPM, or what's the future? Because I think the NPM is still somehow strange, right?
Yeah, but it's somehow strange, but it's also kind of what everyone uses, and so we have all the components are available on NPM, of course, so you can download them from there. I personally, my own projects, I use NPM to download the dependencies. Of course, if you only use lit HTML or just like a very limited amount, you could essentially do what you're doing and copy them over. But I think if you start having more dependencies, that can be kind of difficult
sure.
to manage.
Sure, but if you have more dependencies, I would say, then you have a problem anyway in enterprise fields because everything moves that fast, right? So I would say what's very common is so lit HTML is my proposal, but what we sometimes need is 3DS, like for the charting library.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So without that, forget it. So we have to integrate it somehow, and the integration is also easy. And probably sometimes Moment.js for the dates, but everything else is optional. So we have basically the three main libraries, and everything else is more or less forbidden because or is optional.
Yeah.
Where Vaadin is going? So what is the next ideas, if you can talk about? So what will come? What we can look forward.
Sure. Well, I can speak on a kind of a high level without disclosing too many juicy details. You'll have to follow us online.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, we are in terms of the components, we are extending the set of components. There are still we have a long list of different components that we just haven't had time to build yet, and kind of we started with some of the most, like, we wanted to cover the most common use cases first, and then we go into more specific use case components. So that's something, like I said, we're currently the components are built using Polymer, so we might explore kind of making those leaner using something like lit HTML, or for some components maybe just nothing but the plain standard web components APIs, just kind of making things leaner and cleaner. On the Java side, we are hoping to be able to offer to Java developers the best possible way to build meaningful progressive web apps. So we're hopefully be able to release something around that next year, which I think will be pretty cool. I think progressive web applications make so much sense especially in a business environment. So I'm really hoping that we're able to build something where we can make it easier and more approachable for Java developers who aren't necessarily don't have that much interest in kind of configuring all the moving pieces to be able to build something that's actually working and nice.
Yeah. And where people can find you on the internet, or do you have some resources? So what are the links and the resources you would like to point the listeners to?
Well, if you go to our website, Vaadin.com, you will find in the main menu, there's a link to, or essentially there are two main sections. There's the components, which are the ones that we've been talking about here all day. And then there's Flow, which is essentially the Java server-side engine that you can use if you want to drive these components from the server side.
Okay,
so that's
and your Twitter account?
My Twitter account is at Marcus Hellberg, and Vaadin's Twitter account is just Vaadin.
Just Vaadin, okay. And what is the upcoming web standard where you are really excited about? WebAssembly, you said?
WebAssembly is one thing I think could be pretty interesting to see what we could do in a kind of also business app space. A lot of the use cases currently have been in kind of gaming and virtual reality and stuff like that. But I think you can think of many business cases where you're running fairly complex computations like spreadsheets or encryption or things like that, where it might be interesting.
Or porting legacy app, if you have a C++.
Or porting legacy app. I did see somebody had ported like a JVM on WebAssembly. That sounded scary. Yeah. They were at Chrome Dev Summit. They were also talking about layered APIs as a kind of proposal for the web platform. So that would essentially mean that the web platform could provide this standard library of higher order components that you can install just as basically JavaScript imports from a standard library. So the first one that they've been prototyping with is a generic virtual scroller to kind of reduce the DOM usage and that way kind of help developers build more performant apps. But so that would kind of be one possible way of making it easier for people to build performant and applications.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So exciting times, and I hope I will meet you in person in one of the conferences, so we can exchange, our thoughts on which polyfill we can delete, in the next few weeks.
Yeah, it's been an interesting discussion. I definitely didn't know that you were this into all the cool new web standards, so we'll definitely need to catch up.
Yeah, really, because if you are a Java E developer, and if you look at the web, the only thing which is actually compatible with the backend are web standards.
Yeah.
And what we forgot also to mention, the whole MDN movement, Mozilla Developer Network, which just stands for MDN. It is actually a joint effort of specifying the web platform, which is somehow similar to the JCP we had in the past, right?
Yeah. No, I think a lot of good things are happening on the web right now. It's becoming a much saner place to develop software on.
Yeah. So I wish you great morning. And for me, it's just, an evening.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Adam. Bye-bye.